The 9 situations, I'm not going to read them all, I'm just going to highlight these few. It is the business of a general to be quiet and thus ensure secrecy. He must be able to mystify his officers and men by false reports and appearances and thus keep them in total ignorance. In other words, does a Jesuit foot soldier necessarily understand the whole plot? No. In fact, he's fed misinformation in order that he does not understand the whole plot. But whatever order he gives, when the drum beats once, he does what? He turns to the right. And sharply. And he might not understand the picture, but this is it. He's going to do it. When fire breaks out in an inside of an enemy's camp, respond at once with an attack from outside. So if you see there's a fire burning and they're in trouble, that's when you hit them the hardest. And then he talks about spies. When these 5 kinds of spies, he says you need 5 kinds of spies. You need local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies, and surviving spies. This is incredible. So, these 5 spies you need. None can discover the secret if you have these 5 spies in the system. This is called divine manipulation of the threads. Constantly, this general is bringing God into the picture, and this God that he is quoting is a very deceptive God. Would you agree? So it cannot be the God of the Bible, right? And then he says, let's have a look at local spies, means employing the services of inhabitants of a district. So there will be spies. If there are any spies here this evening, good evening. Then having inward spies is making use of officials of the enemy. Having converted spies, getting hold of the enemy's spies and using them for your own purposes. Doomed spies, doing certain things openly for purposes of deception. And allowing our spies to know of them and report them to the enemy. That's mean. So you'd say to some of your people, I want you to do this. The drum beats, boom, you're going to do it. But it's a deception. And it's something that will rile the country where you are doing this, make them angry. Then you use your other agent to go to the ruler and say, I know who did it. It was them. Then it's your own people. And then they will be arrested and possibly executed. They're doomed spies. They're going to die. But they're your own people. You're going to kill them. What does that achieve for the general? That the ruler now has absolute trust in the spy that told him. And therefore you have an inside angle that you never had before. So sometimes it appears as if the Jesuits are in 2 camps opposing each other and fighting each other, and one of them may be a doomed spy and the other one might be a spy that tells the generals about him. Okay? And then you need surviving spies. Finally, are those who bring back news from the enemy's camp. Hence it is that with none of the whole army are more intimate relations to be maintained than with spies. None should be more liberally rewarded, and no other business should have greater secrecy in order to be preserved. The enemy spies who have come to spy on us must be sought out, tempted with bribes, led away and comfortably housed. Thus they will become converted spies and available for our services. Now, did you know that this book is compulsory reading for the military in this country? Now, with this knowledge in our minds, and we're thinking about the year 1798, the period leading up to it, and the period following. Now, does the devil know the Bible, yes or no? Yes. Okay. If Wesley could figure out that the first beast of Revelation 13 was the papacy, if Martin Luther could figure that out, if Melanchthon could figure that out, if Cranmer could figure that out, if Ridley could figure that out, then surely the devil had it figured out long before them, right? And if Wesley could figure out that the second beast of Revelation chapter 13 was about to appear because it was the end of the 1,260-day period, then surely the devil knows that too. Because he knows God's plan, and his plan is to subvert. So if he knows this is going to happen, is he going to try to be in the field first? Yes or no? Because he wins, who is there? First. Now the Bible tells us that the second beast will deceive the whole world by making fire come down from heaven, deceiving all the people. And this fire cannot be literal fire, because literal fire is anything but deception. It just kills people. Deception must be something else. So this is a form of religion that will emanate eventually out of this chaos, which will enable the first beast to make the second beast do its bidding. So in other words, it must be able to pull the strings in order to do that. So the first thing you do is, what's the problem with the upcoming nation? Well, it's a Protestant nation. It's a Protestant nation. And the upcoming nation is subject to the King of England and the British Parliament, which had banned the Jesuits and Catholicism out of the realm under pain of death. So we have to avoid that. We have to avoid a nation adopting a constitution as the British have, because that would ban Catholicism and expose it for what it is. So we need something else. We need a constitutional system which will guarantee that the Jesuits can never be thrown out. A constitution which lays no claim on religious convictions. That must include them. So that's the first point. Okay. Then what do you do with the Protestants? Well, you divide them up. You infiltrate them. And you create hundreds and eventually thousands and then tens of thousands of denominations. And you pull the strings between all of them. And you make them argue with each other. And you feed them your theology in various forms, so that there are so many theologies, you don't know who's who in this zoo. And then eventually, you get them all so riled up about the situation, which you create in the first place, that they will want to legislate their morality, but the morality must be the morality of the first beast. Does this sound logical? Okay. But the Protestants are weary. The Protestants have a problem. The Protestants know that the Jesuits were there to counter the Reformation. And it's written in all the writings of the Reformers. And all the theologians of the Lutheran Church were exposing the Jesuits as the greatest danger to biblical theology. And the Queen of England had told them, if I ever see you in this country, you're dead. You're not allowed to put your foot in this country. You're banned. And the Jesuit plot to blow up the Parliament had been exposed, and the 6 Jesuits associated with Guy Fawkes were all hung. They were all executed. So how do you get rid of this mindset that the Jesuits are a problem? What's the best thing to do? Disappear. No longer exist. And the same for the Roman Catholic system. If it doesn't exist as a political entity that can command one king to do this and another king to do that at his bidding, well then get rid of it. Get rid of his political power. The Bible says, and one of his heads seemed to have a mortal wound. It doesn't say one of its heads had a mortal wound. It says one of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound. And we know what the date is, 1798, when Napoleon's general marches in and arrests the Pope and takes him away in exile. An aging Pope was already sick, by the way. And the political power of the papacy ends. But that's no use if the Protestants know that the real power behind the throne is the Jesuit general. So you have to get rid of him too. General Ricky, what plans are you going to make the enemy think that you're a pushover and no longer exist? Are you just going to disappear? The Society of Jesus could conquer though believed dead, writes the author of Rulers of Evil. It's a wonderful book to read, by the way. And we're going to take some thoughts from that book, and then we're going to color it in with the present day situation, which we need to understand. Because would you agree that the whole world is at the moment deceived? Yes, so we must know who's pulling the strings of deception. Lorenzo Ricci died in his cell at Castel Angelo on November 24, 1775. That's what history tells us. What if his death was no more physical than the supposed disestablishment of his army? You see, the Jesuits, in the time of Ricci, were being banned out of Europe, left, right, and center. And the countries which had thrown them out in the first place were the Protestant nations. That is understandable. But then, Portugal banned them. Portugal threw out the Jesuits. Spain banned them. Threw out the Jesuits. France banned them. Threw out the Jesuits. And they shipped them in shiploads to the Vatican without food or anything, and many of them died. Many of the Jesuits died, and this was news. You saw it on CNN that night. And what's going on? All these nations, by the way, what are those nations? Portugal, Spain, France. What nations were they? Catholic nations. Now, who ruled over all these Catholic nations in the first place? The Jesuits. They were in every form of government. This is a brilliant strategy. And then to make it look real, well, you kill some of your doomed spies. He speculates further, and he says, during the fall of 1775, Congress authorized a committee made up of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Lynch, Benjamin Harrison, and George Washington to consider and recommend a design for the first united colonial flag. The so-called Flag Committee. And they didn't know what flag to choose for the coming Declaration of Independence. And the Flag Committee, this very prominent Flag Committee, went and met a particular human being that nobody had ever seen, and he was called the Stranger. He was an elderly European transient known only as the Professor. He had arrived unknown to anyone. Nobody knows how he got there. He was just there. But all these prominent men went to have a discussion with the Professor. That's history. In July 3, 1776, John Adams took pen in hand and dashed off a letter to his wife Abigail. Adams was a writer of repute. He took very accurate notes. He never edited. And he wrote very carefully. And he said, yesterday, which must then be July the 2nd, he scribbled, the greatest question was decided which ever was debated in America, and a greater perhaps never was nor will be decided amongst men. A resolution was passed without one dissenting colony, that these united colonies and of a right ought to have full power to make war, conclude peace, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which other states may rightfully do. So they made a decision to declare independence from Britain and to bring about a war. Okay. And the decision was made on the 2nd of July, 1776. So he said this day will go down in history. Now, Manly Palmer Hall, who, as you probably know, is a high Mason, occultist, famous historian, Masonic historian, writes an interesting piece of history. And he talks about this strange man. It was a grave moment, and not a few of those present feared that their lives would be forfeited for their audacity on the 4th of July. In the midst of the debate where they decided, are we really going to go ahead with the decision we made 2 days ago that we're going to be independent? Are we really going to do it? This will cause war. Maybe England will come with so many troops and wipe us out. Are we really going to do this? And while they were in the valley of decision on the 4th of July to put their stamp on it, they started getting cold feet. The debaters stopped and turned to look upon the stranger who had appeared amongst them. Who was this man who had suddenly appeared in the midst and transfixed them with his oratory? They had never seen him before. None knew when he had entered, but his tall form and pale face filled them with awe. This is history. His voice ringing with holy zeal, the stranger stirred them to their very souls. And he gave a tremendous speech, and they all signed the Declaration of Independence. And then he was gone. He had disappeared, nor was he ever seen again, or his identity established. This is recorded in Hall, Secret Teachings, etc. Who was this man? Where did he come from? Well, let's go back a little bit in history, because you have to be in the field before. Then you will gain victory. Maryland history is very interesting because it's bound and grounded to the liturgical calendar of the Roman Catholic Church. We recall how the original settlers of Maryland, many of whom were Roman Catholics, set sail from England under the spiritual direction of Jesuit Father Andrew White on November the 22nd, 1633. So the Jesuits had already come, and they'd occupied land which they called Maryland. It was a huge estate, and it belonged to the Jesuits. It was the feast day of St. Cecilia, a saint, etc., etc. The voyagers reached landfall the following year, March 25th, on Annunciation Day. This is the feast of the angel Gabriel's announcements to the Virgin Mary. On Annunciation Day, 1634, Father White consecrated the colony of Maryland to the Virgin Mary. That's why it's called Maryland. And it was the 2nd day of July in the year 1776, which happened to be Visitation Day. Interesting. Now, if you go to the encyclopedia, then it tells us, commemorating the event recorded in the first chapter of Luke, wherein the Virgin, pregnant with the Messiah, visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. Nowadays, Visitation Day is celebrated on May the 31st, but in the year 1776, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, it was celebrated on July the 2nd. So they have their liturgy calendar. Now, I want you to understand that occultists and Medici learning, Gnosticism, is very strict about their liturgies and their astrological charts and their calendars. God's people should not be involved in such silliness. We have a "Thus says the Lord," and don't have to wait for a certain color of the moon or a shaking or a trembling of whatever sort. I'll give you an example. Peter records that they were on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they heard the voice of God announcing, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." That's a pretty thunderous thing to happen, wouldn't you say? A voice coming from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And then he continues, Peter, and he says, "But we have a more sure word of prophecy, unto which we will do well to take heed." So he says, that which is written, the word of prophecy, is of greater value than even this great miracle of God speaking himself from heaven. What is written down as prophecy is our guideline. So, let's not get too caught up in their funny little dates. It's just for interest's sake. Now, this house over here, I guess you all recognize this, don't you? What is it called? Why is it called the White House? Because it's white? Absolutely not. The other day it was rainbow colors. It's called the White House because it was the state house of Andrew White, the Jesuit. So to this day, it is called the White House. The spiritual director who had prepared the way for this great event. Now, this might seem very strange to the Americans, and I know that some will shout, "Oh, here goes the conspiracy theorist again." I'm just quoting what this person wrote, and I'm looking at the facts, and then I'm looking at what is happening today, and I put the two together, and 1 and 1 happens just to be 3, which is very conspiratorial because it should actually be 2. So this is the White House, and we're not going to go into the details of all of these issues. Fact of the matter is, on this great Jesuit estate, which is called Maryland, today the seat of the greatest, most powerful nation's government is situated. And the first flag that they had decided to adopt was actually a flag of one of the Jesuit trading companies, which means that that flag represented a Jesuit company. That's very fascinating. Now, all countries were expelling the Jesuits, and the Jesuits were thrown out of Portugal. They were thrown out all over the place. This is just from reformation.org history. And it says, what happened to these poor Jesuits? All countries had expelled them. They were shipped off to the Papal States. Some too old for such treatment died. Others left religion or became secular priests. By 1773, the suppression of the Jesuits was complete. On August 16, the brief of suppression was read to the assembled Jesuits, and they dispersed to various locations and other works. And on August 17, Ricky, the unfortunate general, was bundled off to prison in Castel Sant'Angelo. Now, Castel Sant'Angelo was a massive church, occupied building, right next to the Vatican. And it happens to have a passage linking it with the Vatican, so that a pope could go there or a general could go there while apparently appearing to be in prison, where he languished, the poor soul, for 2 years, not even permitted to celebrate Mass or receive visitors. Eventually he died there, this is reformation.org, on November the 24th, 1775, after 15 years as general. That's what history tells us. He testified to the end that the society was innocent And he sent out one letter after the other. Brethren, just pray, pray. You are poor little victims. Pray, pray, and pray. That's all he did. And by order of Pope Pius VI, his solemn funeral was held in the church of San Giovanni de Florentini, the church closest to Ricky's prison, by order of the same Pope. His body was taken to the Gesù, which is the other big Jesuit conclave, which I showed you just last night, where the two founders, or two of the founders of the Jesuit order, are standing on Protestantism and destroying it. Now, it doesn't say who those Protestants are, but I would suggest that they are Luther and maybe Calvin. His body was taken to the Gesù a few hundred meters away and laid to rest in the crypt with the generals who had preceded him. However, Ricky's imprisonment and death and the letter of suppression did not bring the desired end of the society, because Russia did not ban them, and some of the other kingdoms did not ban them. But for general purposes, they were gone, and the title was also removed. He was always general. Then his title was changed to make it more priestly. So that is what happened. And the Jesuits were gone, or so it appeared. Jesuit generals were still selected in Russia, and it was kept alive. But then came the unbanning of the Jesuits with papal approval and a statement which said, never again may the Jesuits be banned, and the title general was reinstated. By the way, the very Pope who ordered this tremendous funeral is the one who was captured by Napoleon. And please remember that Napoleon was a high initiate Freemason in the first place. So this history is very, very interesting. Now, the Jesuits had retrained the minds of the Europeans by something which is called Jesuit theater. And we need to look into this because the war is a battle for the mind. And the Protestants had warned against Jesuit theater. Remember that Martin Luther had said, you may not send your children to be educated where the Bible is not the standard. Remember that? But the Jesuits had become the schoolmasters of Europe, and Jesuit theater was incredibly popular. Encyclopedia Britannica tells us Jesuit drama. Jesuit drama programs of theater developed for educational and propagandist purposes in the colleges of the Society of Jesus during the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Cultivated as a medium for disseminating Roman Catholic doctrine, drama flourished in the Jesuit schools for more than 200 years, evolving from modest student exercises to elaborate productions that often rivaled the contemporary public stage in polish and technical skill. And then it talks about these great performances where the kings attended, and they were swayed. And then afterwards, they were taken to Jesuit retreats where they were subjected to Ignatian spirituality, and slowly, slowly, Protestantism was torn out of the hands of Protestantism. And in Bavaria, for example, the southern state of Germany, the Jesuits took over completely, eradicated the Protestants entirely. By the mid-17th century, there were nearly 300 Jesuit colleges in Europe, and in almost every one at least one play given each year. Jesuit playwrights also drew upon material from pagan mythology. I'm just quoting from encyclopedias. Ancient history and contemporary events, reinterpreted in terms of Catholic doctrine. Dramas were performed in the national language, and their stagecraft kept pace with all the newest technical developments. Now, if you think back to Rome and that magnificent Colosseum, the stagecraft there was out of this world. They would have floors rising, they would have wild beasts